Yeah, my name is Skaperdas. This is a question for Dr. Skaperdas. You very eloquently addressed as an umbrella problem of everything the structural problems of the euro creation. Everybody knows these structural problems. It is a monetary union, it's not a fiscal union. And back in 2001, Romano Prodi, Commissioner of the European Union, said that the political situation is such that we cannot have a fiscal union now. We'll wait for the next crisis to have a fiscal union. Late last year, we had that first step towards a fiscal union. I agree that political union may take another 10 years, but fiscal union is starting taking place. And I suppose that is what Merkel and the rest are trying to do. Use the crisis to create a more integrated union. Even Germany has to yield part of their sovereignty and yield their budget to the European organs for approval before they submit it to the local thing. So that's what the question is that. Second, I agree with you that probably Greece will never pay its debt even with the new agreement. But what, by staying within the euro, they have the pressure to make a change, structural changes. If they leave euro, there will be no incentive to make any structural changes. So Greece is unable to really make any change of their own. Unfortunately, we may have to use Gaddafi's point that the barbarians may be a solution because we've been unable to do it ourselves. That's all. Okay.
So there are two questions. Should I answer them?
Well, the question is whether we need the Europeans to, whether Greece needs the Europeans to make structural change, and if exiting the euro damages that prospect, correct?
That's the second question. The first question was about fiscal union in the European Union.
Fair enough. Yeah.
So the first question about the fiscal union, the December 9th agreement is not an agreement for a fiscal union. Is an agreement about reducing the allowable deficits and levels of debt and imposing penalties in case a country does not follow those policies of deficit, of fiscal deficits. So that's actually, there is nothing absolutely new that is not already written in EU law. It's part of, everything is part of the Stability and Growth Pact. And remember what the Stability and Growth Pact is an agreement that was violated, I believe, by all European Union members in the past, Eurozone members in the past, yes, starting with Germany and France. Yes. So this is warmed over Stability and Growth Pact, which sort of, and if it didn't work, try harder. So that's what it is about. And it does not make sense to tie the hands of individual countries, to force them to have 0.5% deficits of GDP, especially when the conditions would be pretty bad, if the conditions is bad. How are you going to impose on the penalty? Suppose that we have Spain being in this situation in 10 years down the road. How are they going to enforce that? This is what is called time inconsistent policy. It doesn't have any hope of working economically. It's well known because it hasn't worked in the past, we know. When the time comes to impose the policy, everybody will agree that it's not feasible to have those targets for deficit.
There will be penalties, will make it more difficult.
But how are you going to make them with the penalties? How are you going to impose a penalty in Spain or any country when it's in the middle of a depression? How are you going to do that? How are you going to enforce it? So this is number one. Second is that this is politically, it's not going to work because you have elections in France. Sarkozy is unlikely to be re-elected, and his main opponent, Hollande, is against this. So how are you going to do this without having France or anybody else? Everybody is hiding. I mean, they didn't want to go against Merkel. That's why they agreed. I mean, they were forced to agree. But this is nothing new, and it's unsustainable. It's economically and politically unsustainable. It's not. It's far, far, far away from what is needed to have sort of fiscal, not just fiscal union, you need political union. You cannot have fiscal union without democracy. Who is going to make the decisions about taxes and expenditures without having democratic legitimacy? So that's sort of another thing. All this is sort of pie in the sky, just trying to sort of make it so they get through the next month, the next 6 months, and so on. It's actually the politicians of the Eurozone are in a similar position, maybe a little bit better than the Greek politicians, because they are all having a 1 week horizon, or 2 week, or 1 week, or 1 month, no more than that. There are no, apparently, there is some structural problem that where you have no big thinkers as politicians who are able to think ahead, and that sort of interest. Now, concerning the pressure for making changes in Greece, Greece needs to change in many things, I agree. It needs to change the tax collecting service, it needs to improve other aspects of its civil service. The biggest problem is not in the public sector proper, and there are not that many employees compared to the rest of the European Union and the OECD. The problem is in public enterprises like OSE and those places where you have too many workers and all those things. So there are some things that need to be changed. But I disagree with some of the wholesale changes and their effects that they might have. You know, what are you gonna? There was a big fuss in September with the taxi drivers. So I never understood what the problem was with the taxi drivers, because you have plenty of taxis in Greece. The tariffs are set by the negotiation by the government. If you want to reduce the taxi tariffs, then you can do that then. And you're not going to make them, with that proposed sort of solution, you're not going to make them more polite, which that's what they need to be. So that's sort of one of the issues. I think there was, and ultimately what it is that you have a corrupt political class. You're expecting from that class to actually sort of make it less corrupt. And I don't know. You need, I mean, what things have shown is that you need to have a significant change in the number of politicians.
Let me try to say something about this. I mean, I think that maybe we don't understand where we are. Greece is in a coma. It's one step from death.
Yeah.
And to talk theoretically about fiscal unions of people who are okay, or maybe they're you know, they have a bit of a problem somewhere, and maybe France and Germany violated once the fiscal pact by going 1% more. This has nothing to do with our problem. Our problem is Greece is about to die. So the question is, do we do a treatment that makes sense and we fight for it, or do we just give up and say, let's go to the 50s, we're going to become a third world country. We're just going to, well, who cares about drugs? We're going to produce them locally. Are we serious here? Greece is a small country. It's perfectly unable to produce everything. It produces tomatoes, fine, but it doesn't produce everything. I mean, to try to think we're going to live in isolation as if we're Afghanistan, that's completely crazy. Especially Greece. Especially a place in which people from Greece went all over the world and intermingled with everybody, and you are here thousands of miles away. You know, we have to understand what's the real solution that fits with the Greek character. I mean, we're not going to, I think giving up and going back to the 50s is crazy, at least in my opinion. I'm sorry I'm being so extreme about it. And I think the public sector in Greece is problematic. It is the biggest problem. It's not the smallest problem, it's the biggest problem. The fact that procurement is full of corruption is a huge problem. The fact that the Greek government is not willing to fire 15,000 people out of 800,000, and that's considered a problem. I mean, think of your corporations. Think of the percentage. Would you ever have this problem? Does it make sense at all that Greece is going to be stuck on something like that? And it was considered a big deal? I'm sorry, I'm appalled. I mean, we have to have higher standards. And one of the drivers to be in the center of Europe has been a way to create higher standards. that we're not going to live anymore with the crazy Greece laws we had, but we're going to go to the European law. We're going to have restrictions in the money supply. We're not going to print anything we want. I mean, here we're talking about people that we all know are corrupt. And I'm not talking about the present Prime Minister. And we're going to give them the license to print money? I mean, that's insane. I mean, at least that's what I say. I don't even vote in Greece. But still, it doesn't make sense to me. I'm sorry, I went off the subject.
Thank you.
Let me just say something about.
Let's try to keep it brief, though.
Yeah, I think before the euro, Greeks were not living in sort of caves and other places. So they were printing money in the 80s and 90s. Greece had a currency up to the 2002. And at this point, next year, Greece will have lower GDP per capita next year than it had before it entered the Eurozone. It will be a lost decade, and it would be worse off than it was while it had its own currency. I just don't understand how it's going back to the 50s. And who says about Greece getting out of the EU or getting losing being alone? Greece was a US ally and a European ally for all its period during the post-war period.
Okay. Thank you. Sorry, I need to cut it off because we have a lot of questions. Zafiris had a question, and then I'll take these two here.
My mother today on the phone asked me, should she take the money out of the bank and hide it in the pillow, or should she leave it in the bank? So we got one opinion that if we exit, then the banks will not collapse, and we got another opinion that if we default and exit, the bank will collapse. Can you please reconcile these two ideas?
Look, we already said, Greece is in a coma. The situation is difficult. No, it's not that. No, it's not that. I'm sorry.
Please. Let's keep it at 2 minutes per speaker.
Yeah, let me try to go quickly on this. I think if there is an anticipation of the new non-convertible currency, the way Stergios says it, non-convertible with exchange controls and so on, your mother, and not only your mother, but practically everybody in Greece, will take the money out of the banks and put it anywhere, because it's still convertible, because there's euro on it, right? So it doesn't matter if Greece goes bankrupt, it doesn't matter if it prints drachmas, you still have the currency that says euro. So you can convert it, okay? So they will take it out, and the banks are going to collapse. And I don't know what argument can be made that will reverse this point. Now, what would happen if Greece goes bankrupt? All kinds of terrible things are going to happen. So I'm not even going to go.
Yeah. Well, there is.
Can I say something on that? Already the Greeks, they have taken the money out of the banks.
And to a large extent, thank you. Please don't interrupt. No.
Yeah, that's what has happened already, and probably as we speak, there are even more money withdrawn from Greek banks. So it's even within staying with the euro and having this for the next month and a half, there will be huge withdrawals without exiting from the euro. So what happens actually, banks can completely collapse even within the eurozone. Why? Because one thing is that what is going on, the funding now from the ECB is drying up. The last data, actually, there was less funding from the ECB because the Greek banks do not have enough collateral to give to the ECB. And instead, this has been replaced by what is called the emergency liquidity assistance, which comes from the Bank of Greece itself, and it's going up very fast. It's probably over 50 billion euros by now, and this is guaranteed only by the Greek state, meaning the Greek state now that is bankrupt is actually providing an additional 50 billion euro guarantees to Greek banks. So already within the eurozone, it's very likely that, especially when Greece does not have its own currency, when you have your own currency and you take measures, you can support your banks. And when you don't have any monetary base, you don't have any kind of liquidity in the market, you don't have money that is Greek, you can support the financial at the same time and support the banking system, support domestic transactions, and not have inflation at the same time, up to a point. Now everything depends on what the government does, how well it's prepared. I can see that the Greek banking system can completely collapse if Greece defaults and gets out of the Eurozone, if you have the government does not prepare at all. And they think that they will be the cavalry that will come to save them from Europe. Okay. So that's...
What exactly you mean by the government and the central bank of Greece has to do to prepare the country when they don't have any money?
Well, first of all, they
don't address the facts.
Excuse me, but they can, if Greece gets out of the Eurozone, it can print euros with a stamp on it and use them as new drachmas. And this is something that can create, and it can create electronic money within the banking system.
And who's going to honor this?
Okay.
It will pay its work.
I think you're talking nonsense.
Okay, next, sorry. Yeah, sorry about that. Dino, you had a question?
Yeah. I wanted to hear a comment and this is a question for both of you. I wanted to hear a comment on whether the government of Greece could have negotiated better terms. Dr. Economides made a point in the past of Lehman Brothers that created an adverse economic impact on the world economy. Given the analogy with Greece and having this experience in the past, isn't that kind of an example that's been given to the Europe that we can enter a similar scenario that if we did not agree to the terms?
I'm not completely sure of your question, but let me try to answer it. First of all, it has to be understood that both the first memorandum, the Mnemonio 1, and the second one, the May 2010, and the second one, which was passed today, ask for a lot of things that cannot really be done. I mean, there's no doubt about it. And this is because it was written by politicians from both sides, both from Europe and Greece, to say that we are going to do all these great things. Okay. It's more of a political statement. So a lot of things cannot be done. There's no doubt about it. So to consider it a failure if all these things are not be done is not fair, because they cannot be done. On the other hand, Greece didn't do 50% of what it was supposed to do. And that's a failure. And that's a big failure. And that's the failure of the Papandreou government on the last 2 years. They didn't do it. Now, in terms of negotiating, there was a possibility, in my opinion, to tweak the program, to make the program make more sense for Greece, rather than being a generic IMF program, because this was kind of a generic IMF program. And when I say to tweak it, there are some peculiarities in Greece. There is a big informal sector, maybe I should call it black sector, people who don't pay taxes, informal transactions, they don't appear in the books. Greece is a much wealthier country than it appears in the books. The way it appears in the books is like Portugal. You go to Portugal, you say these guys are poor compared to Greece, right? So there is a lot of other things going on. So for every measure, people have to think seriously, how is it going to affect the balance between the formal sector and the informal sector? I mean, will transactions, if we increase the taxes, for example, will transactions move to the other side, to the informal sector? And then the situation would look bad, but maybe something's still going on there. So there are, how can I say, nuances, I mean, that should have been taken into consideration. And ultimately, the IMF did not come to Greece with a very detailed program. It came to Greece and said, look, I mean, these are the things more or less we want you to do, and these are the aggregate numbers we want. And then it was up to Greece to do it, to do the specifics, and they could have done a better job. So that's kind of the answer to my question. Was there a second question?
But did Greece have leverage given the situation of us knowing what happened with the Lehman Brothers.
Yeah, okay, leverage, okay, let me explain the leverage here. Greece had leverage at various points in time, but it didn't have leverage in May 2010. The day that Papandreou went to Caloyeras, of all places, if you remember that picture, and with the background of the sea said, well, I'm sorry, we're bankrupt unless we take this loan. We have to get it. That day, they didn't have leverage. But there were many months before in which he did have leverage, in which he did have the opportunity to do it, and to prepare, like Stergios says, to prepare something. And he didn't prepare, and that's kind of the failure there. But the situation has gotten progressively worse, so I'm not so sure if the present government has actual leverage. But if you think by leverage, the threat that we are going to go bankrupt and you're going to suffer, that's crazy. I mean, Papandreou tried to bluff that way with the referendum idea. Look where it got him. He disappeared from the political scene. I mean, I think that this kind of crazy bluffs, I mean, it might look good in poker, it doesn't look good at the national level.
Well, if you bluff without backing it up, yes, it is a bluff, they call it for you. But that's why you need to be able to prepare to go to default and get out of it seriously. That's what I'm saying. Papandreou was never prepared for that. That's what I'm saying. His whole government was completely captured. They thought, okay, what can you give us, Ms. Merkel? And that's it. But what he had to do, he had to put the people in the Ministry of Finance. Let's study what kind of types of defaults we can go through. How much money is, how many bonds are under Greek law, and then almost all bonds were under Greek law. Greece had the maximum leverage then. If it were prepared to default and study it, and even exit from the Eurozone, and be able to communicate that very under the table. You don't have to go out and shout and say anything, you just do it as you don't even say it, you let it leak somehow through the press. That Greeks are preparing for that. Oh, Greece is preparing. Well, then it's serious. Because if you owe the bank $1,000, it's your problem. If you owe the bank $100 million, then it's the bank's problem. It's similar. It was similar then. It's less so now. Although there is the threat of CDS sort of having a credit event. But that's now probably not less of a threat.
Can I say something more, because of this default, I mean, it's being discussed in back and forth. And I want to make sure what we understand by default. Here, Greece, after the PSI, owns 100 billion to private creditors and 110 billion to the IMF and the European Union. If Greece defaults, does Stergios really mean the 100 billion? Or does he mean the 100 plus 110? Are we going to default against the IMF too? We're going to default against the European partners as well? Because if we're defaulting against only the 100 billion at 4.5%, which is the present interest rate that Greece pays, cost only 4.5%, 4.5 billion a year. So for 4.5 billion a year, we're going to default? Or are we going to default against the whole European community and the IMF and the whole world? Is that what you mean by default? Default to everybody?
So first of all, the 100 billion is not the 100 billion that is sort of thing, because what you have, the Greece now will have to take care of its obligations to its domestic system. You have the 30 billion that will go to the Greek banks. You have, you also probably, the numbers have increased actually, because they have gone to 175 billion. And the numbers, but the 100 billion actually, the other thing is that the 100 billion is the haircut that is calculated that they will receive, but it's not actually what is the, Greece will owe more than that, because you use the real discount rate, you don't, you do the real interest rate, not the discount rate that they're using, which is 10% for the haircuts. So it's more than 100 billion that Greece owes, and that's the 100 billion that Greece would be able to default again, and should be, given the circumstances, and you said earlier as well, that in 6 months, Greece, or 3 months, Greece will have to go back again.
No, but not for that reason. If I can say why I said it because it won't implement the measures. I don't say the measures are wrong, for God's sake. I'm saying the measures are right. They're not implementing them. And if they don't implement them, they'll have to have another round. Not because the measures are wrong, but I say again that even if it's 100, you say it's 120, you say it's 130, you say it's 150, okay, times 4.5%, how much money are we talking a year? Less than 10 billion. For less than 10 billion a year, the Greece is going to become what Papandreou called it, cheats. Papandreou went to the whole world and said Greeks are not to be trusted, they're cheats. And bankruptcy, and open bankruptcy the way Stergios proposes it, is going to underline it. Yes, we are. We are cheats, we're not going to pay, we're not going to do voluntary agreement with anybody, we're just going to pay, we're just going to walk out.
Okay, thank you.
Thanks for the lightning speeches for both of you. I tried to find some commonality between the two of you, and I think probably you both agree that it is common knowledge nowadays that Greece, it's just the tip of the iceberg. We know Italy is already $2.5 trillion, you know, Portugal, Spain. Some people speak about France, and they speak about in the next few months. So if it's true that the surpluses of the north are the deficits of the south, and if the situation continues in the next few months, would this make the workhorse of Europe, Germany, to wisen up and start thinking about, you know, this, you know, political union and fiscal policy to make this, just like we said, you know, the United States of Europe?
Well, this fiscal, supposedly fiscal union, which is not, well, I don't see this happening because there might be some additional measures for sure because they see that things are not improving, and you might have something, you know, in 5 months or something, you could have contemplating some fund or Eurobonds or something like that. That would be a move towards there. But people, and finally, Merkel reneging on this and sort of accepting it. But I think it's always the measures are too little, too late.
There's a man in the back there, right there. Oh, sorry.
As I listen to the numbers, I think that there is a common ground between the two professors, and that is they somehow you both agreed that the Greek banks are either bankrupt by now or about to be bankrupt real soon. Whether you take your scenario or your scenario, is this true? This is what came across as I studied the numbers that you gave. So the question that I have is to both of you: what do you propose then to stop the banks from becoming bankrupt? Because if they become bankrupt, then of course a lot of people in Greece will lose their savings that they worked all their lives for.
Sure. I think that the solution is actually simple. You know that in 2008 Citibank was bankrupt, right? I don't know if you have money in Citibank yourself, but a lot of people have it in New York, right? So Citibank was bankrupt. Everybody knew it. So what did the US government do? It gave them a loan and got shares in return. Okay. And it worked. Citibank is alive, its value of the shares is very low compared to what it used to be, but it's alive and it does business. So what does the European Union do for the Greek banks? It gives them 30 billion. 30 billion is more than enough for them to do okay. Okay? And this is part of the 130 that is being voted, that was voted today. So it gives them this 30 billion. Now, it's going to go through Greece and through the Bank of Greece. And in return for getting this 30 billion, the Greek government, the Greek state, is going to get shares. And these are going to be common shares, which means with voting rights. But with the voting rights, I read the details of the very long agreement, the voting rights suspended for 5 years. So essentially, if the Greek banks manage to revive in 5 years, they will keep the same leadership, CEOs and so on. If they don't manage to revive in 5 years, then they become part of the Greek state, essentially. But that's not a bad solution. I mean, look, at least it worked in the United States. Of course, the United States is a different animal compared to Greece, but still, it worked.
We have FDIC in the United States, there's no FDIC in Greece.
Are you?
I'm sorry.
Yes.
We have the Federal Deposit and Insurance Corporation here that comes in and makes good on the deposits.
The same thing exists in Europe.
Something very similar.
I would like to ask both speakers, thank you for a very informative and discussion. You alluded to a political crisis. It's a lot of people say that in fact the basic problem in Europe, as it is, of course, in Greece and even in the United States, a political problem. Could you tell us a little bit, maybe in a year from now or down the road, what is going to happen in the political situation in Greece? Because it looks like by now that the political parties are, nobody trusts them. And the movement to the left that you alluded to is one indicator.
Well, that's one of the problems is that now, as of today, both main political parties in Greece are discredited. So you could have had, I thought Samaras was saving himself for sort of later. And unfortunately, he burned himself today. So what will happen then is political turmoil that nobody can predict. And certainly a year from now, I will not venture a prediction of what will happen. So that's sort of the scary part of it, because you would hope that you will have a prefect from Evros or something like that will come out and unite the population or something. Some people will say populist, but say, well, Greece should default and exit the euro and get sort of a lot of support. But it might not be possible, and what is likely then is to go from failing government to failing government, and then getting out in an uncontrolled way, defaulting, and getting out of the Eurozone again, sort of being left alone. That's a real scenario.
Let me comment briefly on this. There are three parties on the left, each with about 12%, according to the polls. I mean, they're very small right now, but the polls say they're going to get 12% in the election in the next couple of months. All three parties are essentially saying, all three left-wing parties say that Greece should leave the euro. One of them is the succession of the Stalinist Communist Party, non-Stalinist anymore, but still they're the same people. Then there are other people who call themselves radicals, radical coalition of the left, and a third one called the democratic left or something like that. All three say Greece should leave the euro, should just print grounds for their own reasons. I mean, if you read Cook's analysis, essentially they say, "Oh, this is the Europe of the capitalists who don't want to be part of it." If you read the other people, they say something slightly different. But in any case, they get votes. Why do they get votes? Not necessarily because the average Greek think that, you know, Stalin was right or Khrushchev was right or anything like that, but because they suffer. They don't like the present situation, so they vote for opposition parties. Now, how it's going to evolve, it's very difficult to say. Most likely, Samaras, the right-wing party, is going to be elected with some relative majority. It's not clear if he's going to make a government by himself or not. How it's going to evolve in the long run, I really don't know. But if my feeling, and I explained before, is that if we actually go to default for whatever reason and go to the drachma, the situation is going to get radically much worse. And then all things can happen. I wouldn't venture any prediction after that.
Last question, we only have 5 minutes.
Could you comment on the implication of the default, no default option in terms of the effect on the European and the American economy?
Yeah, I think that the default by Greece is going to be very upsetting for many European markets and US markets in a similar way as the Lehman default had unpredictable effects in them.
Well, there are indications that, at least for the Germans and other Northern Europeans, that they supposedly have ring-fenced the possibility of Greek default, including CDS. So they expect that it will not be a Lehman event, but it could be. The question, though, is Greece, I mean, if Greece did not exist, you would have, a year down the road, you would have Portugal and Ireland or something. It's not Greece's fault for having an international financial system that is so fragile because it was not reformed after 2008. And you have a Eurozone that has its own problems. So if something happening in Greece, Greek default, triggers a worldwide collapse, which I think at this point is probably not, is not highly likely, then there is a serious problem with that the international financial system needs reform, including how you deal with credit default swaps, how you regulate them, what kind of markets we have, and those things.
I actually think that if it's not an issue of the credit default swaps. There are credit default swaps, insurance essentially against Greece going bankrupt. But that market is very, very small. I think there are a few $1 billion only in that market. So I don't think that this is going to be what we're worried about. But if Greece defaults, the Greek banks are going to collapse. And when the Greek banks collapse, they have bilateral agreements. The banking system is pretty integrated around the world. And the counterparties are going to feel the Greek default. And suddenly, something they expected from a Greek bank is not going to be available to them. And this is going to go throughout the world in a very similar way as what happened with Lehman. Look, the smartest people in the world were running the Treasury Department. They thought nothing is going to happen because Lehman is going to collapse. And then all hell broke loose when Lehman collapsed. So it's very hard to anticipate fully the effects of a Greek default.
Okay, thank you very much. If you have any additional questions, I'm not sure if the speakers are staying for a little bit at least. And we have to empty the room by 8 o'clock, but everybody's more than welcome to stay outdoors. Also, the Greek Consul General has joined us a little delayed, but thank you for coming. Yeah, that's it. Thank you for coming.
Thank you for coming, and thank you speakers for this insight. Let's hope for the best, or maybe pray. And I hope that all of you will make it to the next event of the American Hellenic Council at the end of March at the Omni Hotel in downtown LA. Thank you very much again.